You will marry my brother, or you will leave this house tonight, with nothing but the clothes on your back." Lady Catherine Howard stood in the grand drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, her heart pounding as those words echoed off the marble walls. Behind her, rain lashed against the tall windows. Before her, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Cavendish, her supposed benefactor, glared with eyes like steel. But here's what no one in that room knew. Standing in the shadows of the corridor, having arrived unexpectedly from London, was someone who would change everything. Alexander Cavendish, the 8th Duke of Thornfield, had heard every word. And when Catherine walked out that door with her head held high, he would make a decision that would scandalize all of English society. This is their story. Are you ready? Let me tell you about 3 people whose lives collided on a stormy November evening in 1892, in the English countryside where old money, older traditions, and the weight of family expectations could crush even the strongest spirit. Catherine Howard, 23 years old, orphaned daughter of a minor baronet who'd lost everything in bad investments. She'd come to Thornfield Manor 6 months earlier as a companion to the Dowager Duchess, a position that was equal parts servant and guest, never quite belonging anywhere. Alexander Cavendish, the 8th Duke of Thornfield, 31 years old, freshly returned from 3 years managing the family's shipping interests in India. Tall, with dark hair touched with early silver at the temples, he was known in London society as the Duke who never smiled, a man more comfortable with ledgers than ballrooms, who'd buried himself in work after a broken engagement years before. And finally, Edward Cavendish, Alexander's younger brother by 5 years, charming and handsome but weak-willed, a gambler who'd run up debts across London and was now his mother's last hope for redemption through a profitable marriage. Now, let me take you to where it all began. Catherine had known this confrontation was coming. She'd felt it building for weeks, ever since Edward Cavendish had started paying her unwanted attention, appearing in doorways where she walked, sending her flowers she never asked for, making comments that straddled the line between compliment and presumption. The Dowager Duchess had been watching it all with calculating eyes, and Catherine understood why. Edward needed money, and Catherine, despite her poverty, had one valuable asset. She was beautiful, well-educated, and most importantly, respectable enough to marry into the family without causing scandal, yet desperate enough that she might accept a man she didn't love. "I don't understand your hesitation," the Dowager Duchess Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she poured tea in the drawing-room that evening. "Edward is offering you everything a woman in your position could hope for. Title, security, a place in society." Catherine set down her teacup with steady hands, though her insides churned. "Your Grace, I am deeply grateful for your hospitality these past months. But I cannot marry a man I do not love, nor one who does not love me." "Love?" Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking crystal. "My dear child, love is a luxury for people who can afford it. You are a penniless orphan living on charity. Edward is willing to overlook your situation. Many men would not be so generous." "Then many men would have my thanks for their honesty," Catherine replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I would rather make my own way in the world than enter a marriage built on desperation and convenience." The Dowager Duchess's expression hardened. She set down her own teacup and stood, her silk skirts rustling like a serpent moving through grass. "Very well. Let me be perfectly clear, Miss Howard. Edward has asked for your hand. I support this match. You will give him your answer tomorrow morning, and that answer will be yes. And if it isn't?" Catherine stood as well, meeting the older woman's eyes. "Then you will leave this house. Immediately. I have tolerated your presence as a companion, but I will not harbor a guest who insults my family with rejection." Margaret moved to the window, her back rigid. "You have no family, no money, no prospects. Where will you go? What will you do?" Catherine felt the walls of the elegant room closing in. The rain against the windows seemed to mock her predicament. "I will find a position somewhere. As a governess, perhaps, or without a reference from me. My dear, you are delusional." Margaret turned, and her smile was cruel. "Every respectable household in England knows the Cavendish name. One word from me, and no one will hire you. You'll end up in some workhouse, or worse." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. Catherine's mind raced through her options, each one more bleak than the last. She thought of Edward, pleasant enough in company, but she'd seen how he treated the servants when he thought no one was watching, heard the whispers about his gambling, noticed how his charm evaporated the moment he didn't get his way. "I need time to think," Catherine said finally. "You have until morning," Margaret replied. 9 o'clock sharp. You will come to this room and give Edward your answer. Choose wisely, Miss Howard. Pride is cold comfort on an empty stomach. But what the Dowager Duchess didn't know was that her eldest son had arrived home hours earlier than expected. Alexander Cavendish had taken a private carriage from London, slipping in through the servants' entrance to avoid the fuss his mother always made over his arrivals. He'd wanted a quiet evening to review estate documents before announcing his presence. He'd been standing in the corridor outside the drawing room, about to enter, when he heard his mother's voice raised in anger. Something made him pause, his hand on the door handle, and listen. Now, as Catherine rushed past him in the dimly lit hallway, tears streaming down her face though she tried to hide them, Alexander found himself at a crossroads of his own. He could ignore what he'd heard. It was, after all, family business, and he'd learned long ago not to interfere in his mother's schemes. He could go to his study, pour a whiskey, and let events unfold as they would. Or, Alexander thought of his brother Edward, with his gambling debts and empty charm. He thought of his mother, whose manipulations had driven away every genuine person who'd ever tried to be part of their family. And he thought of the young woman who'd just walked past him, her head held high despite her tears, choosing dignity over security. He made his decision. Catherine threw her belongings into a worn leather trunk with trembling hands. She owned so little, it was almost laughable. A few dresses, some books, her mother's pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry she'd managed to keep, and a miniature portrait of her parents. Where would she go? She had exactly £7.03 to her name. Enough for a train ticket to London and perhaps a week in a modest boarding house while she searched for work. Without a reference, her options were grim, but anything was better than shackling herself to Edward Cavendish for the rest of her life. She was fastening the trunk when she heard a soft knock on her door. "Catherine." It was Sarah, one of the housemaids who'd become something of a friend. "Miss, what's happening? There's talk below stairs that you're leaving." Catherine opened the door. "News travels fast. Are you really going? Tonight? In this storm?" Sarah's eyes were wide with concern. "I don't have much choice." Catherine tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Could you help me carry this trunk downstairs? I'll walk to the village and catch the morning train to London." "Walk? It's 3 miles in the pouring rain. Miss Catherine, please, at least wait until morning." "I can't. I won't spend another night under this roof accepting charity I'll have to pay for with my freedom." Catherine lifted one end of the trunk. "Come on, before anyone tries to stop us." The two women struggled down the servants' staircase, the trunk bumping against the narrow walls. They'd nearly reached the back entrance when a voice stopped them cold. "Going somewhere, Miss Howard?" Catherine's heart sank. She turned to find Edward Cavendish leaning against the doorframe, a glass of brandy in his hand and an unpleasant smile on his face. "Let me pass, please, Mr. Cavendish." "Is that any way to speak to your future husband?" Edward pushed off from the doorframe and walked closer. Catherine could smell the alcohol on his breath. Mother told me about your little conversation. You're being very foolish, you know. The only foolish thing I've done is stay as long as I have. Catherine kept her voice steady, though fear prickled along her spine. Sarah had quietly disappeared, probably to fetch help, Catherine hoped. Edward circled around her like a predator. You think you're too good for me? You, with your shabby dresses and your charity case position? I'm offering you a life most women would kill for. Then offer it to one of them. Catherine tried to move past him, but he grabbed her arm. You're not leaving. Let me go. Make me. Edward's grip tightened, and his smile turned nasty. You know what I think. I think you need to learn some gratitude. I think you should release the lady. Now. The voice came from the shadows of the corridor, deep and commanding. Edward's hand dropped from Catherine's arm as if burned. Both of them turned to see a tall figure step into the lamplight. Alexander Cavendish looked nothing like his brother. Where Edward was soft and pretty, Alexander was all hard angles and intensity. His dark eyes swept over the scene, missing nothing: Catherine's tear-stained face, the trunk on the floor, Edward's guilty expression. Alexander. Edward tried for jovial and missed by a mile. I didn't know you were home. Catherine and I were just. I heard what you were doing. Leave. Now. The command in Alexander's voice was absolute. Edward hesitated, looking between his brother and Catherine, then slunk away like a scolded dog. Catherine found herself alone with the Duke of Thornfield, her employer's son, a man she'd seen perhaps twice during her months at the estate. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your Grace, I apologize for the disturbance. I was just leaving. In a storm. With nowhere to go. Alexander glanced at her trunk. I don't think so. Catherine's chin came up. With respect, Your Grace, it's not your decision to make. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or was it respect? You're right. It's not. But I'm making you an offer nonetheless. I won't marry your brother. I'm not asking you to. Alexander moved closer, and Catherine caught the scent of rain and leather and something else, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't understand. I'm asking you to stay. As my guest, not my mother's companion. Until you've had time to make proper arrangements for your future. Why would you do that? Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Because I heard what my mother said to you. And because I watched you choose your dignity over your security, and that's... He paused, searching for words. That's rare. I respect it. Catherine searched his face, looking for the trap, the angle, the scheme. But all she saw was sincerity and something else, a bone-deep weariness that matched her own. I can't accept charity, Your Grace. Then don't think of it as charity. Think of it as... Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly uncomfortable with this kind of conversation. As a business arrangement. You need time and resources to secure your future. I need someone I can trust to help me sort through my late father's correspondence. He left boxes of letters that need organizing. Consider it employment. Your mother won't allow it. My mother, Alexander said with quiet steel in his voice, does not run this estate. I do. Will you stay? Catherine looked at the trunk at her feet, at the door leading out into the storm, at the uncertain future waiting beyond. Then she looked at Alexander Cavendish, this serious, complicated man who just offered her a lifeline with no strings attached. I'll stay, she said. For now. The next morning, Catherine woke in a guest room in the East Wing, as far from the family quarters as possible, at her own request. Someone had brought her breakfast on a tray. Proper breakfast, not the cold toast and weak tea she'd grown accustomed to as a companion. She was halfway through her eggs when Sarah burst in without knocking. "Miss Catherine, you won't believe what's happened." "What is it?" "The Dowager Duchess is in a right fury. She's saying you've bewitched the Duke, that you've used feminine wiles to turn him against his own family. She's demanded that he dismiss you immediately, and he—" Sarah paused for dramatic effect. He told her that if she couldn't be civil to his guests, she was welcome to remove herself to the London house. Catherine's fork clattered to her plate. "He said what?" "I heard it myself." Was bringing fresh linens past the breakfast room. The Duke was calm as you please, reading his newspaper, while the Dowager went absolutely purple. Then Mr. Edward tried to speak up, and the Duke cut him off too. Said something about how Edward should be more concerned with his debts than with who was staying in the house. Catherine's mind reeled. Alexander had stood up to his mother. For her. A virtual stranger. "There's more," Sarah continued, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of drama. "The Duke has asked that you join him in the library at 10 o'clock to begin work on those letters he mentioned. And Miss Catherine, every servant in this house is talking about it. They're saying it's the first time anyone's ever seen the Duke really stand up for something. He's always been so proper, so controlled, but this morning, it was like watching a different person." After Sarah left, Catherine sat at the small writing desk by the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. She'd gone from facing destitution to being at the center of a family drama that could only end badly for her. The sensible thing would be to leave anyway. To slip out before she became even more entangled in the Cavendish family's dysfunction. But when 10 o'clock came, she found herself walking to the library. Alexander was waiting, surrounded by boxes of correspondence that rose like towers around the long mahogany table. He looked up when she entered, and Catherine noticed that in the morning light, his eyes were actually a deep grey, not the black they'd seen the night before. "Miss Howard. Thank you for coming." He gestured to the boxes. "As you can see, I wasn't exaggerating about the scope of this project. Your Grace, about last night, and this morning. I don't want to cause trouble between you and your family." "You haven't caused anything," Alexander said firmly. "My family has been dysfunctional for years. You simply had the misfortune of getting caught in the middle of it." He pulled out a chair for her. "Now, shall we work? I find that focus on a task is excellent for avoiding dwelling on unpleasant situations." They worked in companionable silence for an hour, sorting letters by date and subject. Catherine found herself relaxing in Alexander's presence. He was nothing like Edward. There were no flowery compliments, no attempts to stand too close or engineer situations where they might touch accidentally. He was simply present, focused, real. "Why did you do it?" The question slipped out before Catherine could stop it. Alexander looked up from the letter he was reading. "Why did I do what?" "Stand up to your mother. Defend me. You don't know me." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing the edge of an envelope. "When I was 16, he said finally, I fell in love with the daughter of our village blacksmith. Isabella. She was brilliant, taught herself to read, had opinions on everything from politics to poetry. My mother forbade me from seeing her, of course. Said it was beneath my station." Catherine waited, sensing there was more. "I was weak. I did what I was told. I let Isabella go, married the appropriate woman my mother chose, Lady Victoria Pemberton. The engagement lasted 6 months before Victoria ran off with a cavalry officer. Caused an enormous scandal." Alexander's smile was bitter. "My mother blamed Victoria, called her all manner of names. But I knew the truth. Victoria left because I was a coward who cared more about duty than genuine human connection. She deserved better." "What happened to Isabella?" "Married a teacher. Moved to Cornwall. I heard she's happy, has 3 children. Alexander met Catherine's eyes. I learned something from that experience. There's a difference between duty and cowardice, between family loyalty and enabling cruelty. Last night, when I heard my mother trying to force you into a marriage you didn't want, threatening you with destitution if you didn't comply, I decided I was done being a coward. The honesty in his words took Catherine's breath away. Here was a duke, a man of enormous wealth and power, admitting his failures to a woman he barely knew. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "Thank you for not judging it too harshly." Alexander returned to his letters, but Catherine noticed a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Catherine spent her mornings working with Alexander in the library, her afternoons in the estate's impressive gardens. Now that she was a guest rather than a companion, she had free time, and her evenings reading in her room or occasionally dining with Alexander when his mother and brother were away. The Dowager Duchess Margaret had taken to pretending Catherine didn't exist, which was a relief. Edward sulked and made snide comments when forced to acknowledge her presence, but Alexander's protective presence kept him at a distance. But Catherine wasn't naive. She knew this couldn't last. She was living in a bubble that would inevitably burst. What she didn't know was that the burst would come from an unexpected direction. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Lady Victoria Pemberton, Alexander's ex-fiancée, arrived at Thornfield Manor in a flurry of expensive silk and dramatic pronouncements. Catherine was in the garden, reading beneath an oak tree, when she heard the commotion. She looked up to see an elegant carriage pulling up to the main entrance, and from it emerged a woman who could only be described as stunning. Blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a dress that probably cost more than Catherine had earned in her entire life, and a bearing that screamed aristocratic confidence. "Alexander." Victoria's voice carried across the grounds. "Alexander, darling, I simply must speak with you." Catherine's stomach dropped. She told herself it was none of her business, that Alexander's romantic life had nothing to do with her. But she couldn't deny the twist of jealousy that surprised her with its intensity. She tried to return to her book, but the words swam meaninglessly on the page. 15 minutes later, Sarah appeared, practically vibrating with news. "Miss Catherine, you won't believe it. Lady Victoria is here, and she's crying in the drawing room, saying she made a terrible mistake leaving the Duke, and she wants him back." That's between them," Catherine managed. "But miss, she's telling everyone that she's come to claim what's rightfully hers, and that she won't leave until Alexander agrees to reinstate their engagement." Sarah's eyes were wide. The Dowager Duchess is beside herself with joy. She's already planning the wedding breakfast. Catherine felt sick. Of course this would happen just when she'd started to what? To imagine there might be something more than employer and employee between her and Alexander. How foolish. "I need to go," she said, standing abruptly. "I need to pack." "Pack? Why?" "Because this was always temporary, Sarah. And now it's time for reality to reassert itself." But before Catherine could reach her room, she encountered Alexander in the corridor. His expression was thunderous. "Miss Howard. We need to talk." "Your Grace, I understand that circumstances have changed. Lady Victoria is a manipulative woman who realized her cavalry officer didn't have any money and decided to see if she could reclaim her safety net," Alexander interrupted. "I'm not interested in her apologies or her schemes. But that's not what I need to discuss with you." He gestured to his study, and Catherine followed, her heart pounding. Once the door was closed, Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine had learned meant he was agitated. "My mother has given me an ultimatum. Either I reinstate my engagement to Victoria, or she'll ensure that every newspaper in London runs a story about how I've been keeping an inappropriate companion under my roof." She'll destroy your reputation utterly. Catherine sat down heavily. I see. I want to fight this. I want to tell her to go to hell and print whatever she likes. But Catherine. Alexander's voice was raw with frustration. I've seen what scandal does to women in your position. It would destroy any chance you have of securing honest employment. You'd be ruined. So you're going to marry Lady Victoria? Catherine tried to keep her voice neutral, but it came out broken. No. Alexander moved to stand in front of her. I'm going to ask you something completely insane, and I want you to feel absolutely free to refuse. Catherine looked up at him, confused. Marry me, Alexander said. Not for love, not for society, but as a business arrangement. I need a wife to satisfy my family's demands and secure the succession. You need security and social standing. We could make it work. Catherine felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. You're asking me to enter exactly the kind of loveless marriage I refused with your brother. No. I'm asking you to enter a partnership with someone who respects you, who will give you freedom to pursue your own interests, who will never demand more than you're willing to give. Alexander's grey eyes were intense. Edward wanted to own you. I'm offering you alliance. This is madness. Probably. But it's also the only move on the chessboard that defeats my mother's scheme while protecting both of us. Alexander's voice softened. I won't pretend I'm offering you romance, Catherine. But I am offering you respect, security, and honest partnership. That's more than most marriages in our circle can claim. Catherine's mind raced. It was madness. But it was also tempting. Not just for the security, though that mattered. But because in the 2 weeks she'd spent working alongside Alexander, she'd come to genuinely like him. Respect him. Even care for him, though she hardly dared admit it. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. I'll hold off my mother's demands for as long as I can. Catherine didn't sleep that night. She paced her room, weighing options, examining motivations, trying to see all the angles. Marrying Alexander would solve her immediate problems. She'd have security, position, protection from scandal. But at what cost? Would she be trading one form of entrapment for another? But as dawn broke, Catherine realized something important. Alexander wasn't asking her to change who she was. He wasn't asking her to perform love she didn't feel. He was simply asking her to be herself, but with the protection and resources of his name and title. And if she was honest, brutally, terrifyingly honest, she was already halfway to loving him anyway. His quiet strength, his unexpected humor, the way he listened when she spoke as if her opinions actually mattered. If she was going to be married, wasn't it better to marry someone she actually liked and respected? She made her decision. At breakfast, she found Alexander alone in the morning room. He looked as if he'd slept as poorly as she had. Yes, she said simply. Alexander looked up, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. On one condition. Name it. Honesty. Complete honesty between us, always. This may start as a business arrangement, but if we're going to spend our lives together, I won't tolerate lies or games. We may not love each other now, but we can at least have truth. Alexander stood and crossed to her, taking her hand in both of his. You have my word. Complete honesty, always. Then I suppose we should inform your mother that her plans have changed. Alexander's smile was fierce and joyful. This is going to be spectacular. The Dowager Duchess Margaret was holding court in the drawing room with Lady Victoria when Alexander and Catherine entered together. Edward was there too, draped over a settee like a sulking child. Alexander, darling. Victoria rose, extending her hands dramatically. I've been waiting to continue our conversation. Your mother and I have been planning the most wonderful. That won't be necessary, Alexander interrupted calmly. I'm engaged to be married. To Miss Howard. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Victoria's mouth fell open in a most unladylike manner. Edward sat up so quickly he nearly toppled off the settee. You're what? Margaret found her voice first, and it was shrill with fury. You heard correctly, Mother. Catherine has agreed to be my wife. We'll marry by special license within the month. This is absurd. She's a nobody. A penniless orphan. Margaret set down her teacup with a clatter. I forbid it. You have no authority to forbid anything, Alexander said, his voice like ice. I am the Duke of Thornfield. This is my decision. Victoria's shock was shifting to cold calculation. You're doing this to spite me. To punish me for leaving. Victoria, I assure you, I haven't thought about you in years. This has nothing to do with you. Then what? Victoria's voice turned shrill. What does this creature have that I don't? Catherine had been silent until now, but that comment sparked something in her. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. Character. Honesty. The ability to value someone for who they are rather than what they can provide. Shall I continue? How dare you? Victoria advanced on Catherine, but Alexander smoothly stepped between them. I think it's time for you to leave, Victoria. Your carriage is waiting. You'll regret this, Victoria hissed. Both of you. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Excellent. Save me the cost of wedding announcements. Alexander's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were steel. After Victoria stormed out, Margaret turned to her son with a look of pure venom. You are throwing away everything, your reputation, your position, for her. No, Mother. I'm claiming my life for myself. There's a difference. Alexander took Catherine's hand. You're welcome to attend the wedding. Or you're welcome to join Victoria in London. But this decision is final. Margaret looked between them, clearly searching for some angle of attack, some way to regain control. When she found none, her face twisted into an ugly expression Catherine had never seen before. You will both pay for this humiliation. Mark my words. Is that a threat, Mother? Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. It's a promise. Margaret swept from the room, leaving only Edward behind. Edward looked at Catherine with something like grudging respect. You played this brilliantly. I underestimated you. I didn't play anything, Catherine replied. I simply chose honesty over manipulation. You should try it sometime. After Edward slunk away, Alexander turned to Catherine with concern in his eyes. Are you all right? That was rather intense. I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine. Catherine realized she was smiling. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Alexander's expression softened into something Catherine had never seen before, genuine warmth. So do I. They married 3 weeks later in the Thornfield Manor Chapel, with only the necessary witnesses present. Margaret had decamped to London in high dudgeon, and Edward had disappeared to who knows where to avoid his creditors. But Catherine didn't care about the absent guests. As she stood beside Alexander and spoke her vows, she felt something shift inside her. What had started as a practical arrangement was transforming into something else entirely. The first sign came during the ceremony, when Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. The second came when he kissed her, a brief, proper kiss that nonetheless sent electricity through her entire body. And the third sign. That came on their wedding night. They'd agreed beforehand that theirs would be a white marriage, unconsummated, purely practical. They'd maintain separate bedrooms and live as cordial business partners rather than true husband and wife. But as Catherine stood in her dressing gown in the doorway between their adjoining rooms, looking at Alexander seated by his fireplace reading a book, she realized she didn't want that anymore. Alexander. He looked up, setting aside his book. Catherine. Is something wrong? No. I wanted to say thank you. For everything. For seeing me when others looked through me. For offering me respect when others offered only transaction. For being honest when the world rewards deception. Alexander rose and crossed to her. You don't need to thank me for treating you like a human being. That should be the baseline, not the exception. In my experience, it's rare enough to deserve recognition. Catherine hesitated, then took a breath and spoke the truth that had been growing in her heart. I need to tell you something. This arrangement we made, it was honest at the time. But I need to be honest now about how things have changed. At least for me. Catherine. Let me finish. I'm falling in love with you, Alexander. Maybe I already have. I know that wasn't part of our agreement, and if you don't feel the same, I won't make demands. But I promised you honesty, and I can't start our marriage with this secret between us. The silence that followed felt endless. Catherine braced herself for gentle rejection, for awkwardness, for the ruining of the comfortable partnership they'd built. Instead, Alexander cupped her face in his hands and smiled. Really smiled, the first time she'd seen it, and it transformed his whole face. Catherine Howard, you are the bravest person I've ever met. Do you know when I started falling for you? It was that first night, when you chose to walk out into a storm rather than compromise your principles. I stood in that hallway and thought, that is a woman worth knowing. Every day since then has only confirmed it. You feel the same. I married you because it was practical. But I'm standing here now because I love you. Deeply. Irrevocably. Alexander's thumb traced her cheekbone. I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid I'd pressure you, that you'd feel obligated because of our arrangement. But yes, Catherine. I love you. The kiss that followed was nothing like the brief ceremony kiss. This was deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, Catherine was breathless and laughing. So much for our white marriage, she gasped. Alexander grinned, actually grinned, and swept her into his arms. I believe we should renegotiate the terms of our agreement. I believe you're right. 1 year later, Catherine stood in the Thornfield Gardens, her hand resting on her swollen belly, watching Alexander play with their rescue dogs. 3 mutts he'd insisted on adopting from the village despite his mother's horror. So much had changed in a year. The Dowager Duchess had eventually accepted their marriage, though she maintained a chilly distance. Edward had actually managed to turn his life around after marrying a wealthy American heiress who kept him on a very short leash. And Victoria. She'd married a minor German prince and moved to Bavaria, from which she sent the occasional barbed letter that Alexander immediately burned. But the real changes were internal. Catherine had discovered a love of estate management and had taken over the charitable works of the duchy, establishing schools for poor children and job training programs that were becoming models for other estates. Alexander had loosened his rigid control, learning to laugh and play and live rather than merely exist. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his hands on their child. About how different my life might have been if I'd said yes to Edward. If I'd taken the easy path instead of walking out into the storm. Do you regret anything? Catherine turned in his arms to face him. Not a single moment. The storm led me to you. To this. To us. She placed her hand over his on her belly. To our future. You know what I think. Alexander kissed her forehead. I think you saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe more. We saved each other, Catherine corrected. That's what partners do. As the sun set over Thornfield Manor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd been given an ultimatum: marry a man she didn't love, or leave with nothing. She'd chosen nothing, and in doing so, had found everything. So what does this story teach us? It teaches us that sometimes the scariest choice, the one that looks like loss, is actually the path to winning. Catherine could have taken the safe route. She could have married Edward, had security and comfort and a life of quiet misery. Instead, she chose uncertainty. She chose dignity. She chose herself. And in doing so, she opened up space for real love to find her. Think about the choices you face in your own life. How often do you choose comfort over authenticity? How often do you accept less than you deserve because the alternative looks too hard, too risky, too uncertain? Catherine's story reminds us that we teach people how to treat us. When she refused to be bullied into a marriage she didn't want, she set a standard. And Alexander, a man who'd spent his whole life conforming to expectations, saw that standard and recognized it as something worth rising to meet. Real love doesn't come from desperation or manipulation. It comes from two people seeing each other clearly and choosing each other freely. The Dowager Duchess thought she could control everyone through fear and social pressure. Victoria thought she could reclaim Alexander through dramatics and timing. Edward thought he could wear Catherine down into accepting him. They all underestimated what happens when someone decides they'd rather have nothing than something false. So here's my question for you. What are you settling for in your life? Where are you choosing comfort over truth? And what might become possible if you found the courage to walk out into your own storm? The answer might surprise you. It certainly surprised Catherine.